Alright, those of you out there who follow the creation, evolution, intelligent design debate will understand, you'll know that there's an argument out there that science is not allowed to consider the possibility of an intelligence, science is not allowed to consider the possibility of the supernatural, science is not allowed to consider the possibility of God. In a nutshell, science is not allowed to consider anything outside of the physical, natural, material world, and science is not allowed to consider the possibility of an intelligence. Now this argument just does, when it's examined objectively, it just does not hold water with the facts. It doesn't hold water with the history of science, and it doesn't hold water. It just doesn't hold water. Period. This is really just a self-serving argument. Now, one of the reasons for this is in science we consider the possibility of an intelligence all the time. I mean, any of you who ever watched CSI or NCIS will know that you have scientists in a laboratory trying to figure out if a death occurred by natural means or from an intelligence, i.e. a murder. And of course, in a court of law, if we were to say, well, we're not allowed to ever consider the possibility that someone was murdered even if they have a knife sticking out of their back, then we wouldn't have a very good legal system, would we? And I guess a lot of people out there will probably leave comments saying we don't have a very good one anyway, but I want to respect the government here to an extent, but feel free to leave any comments you want. Moving on. The SETI program is another example of where science often considers the possibility of intelligence. Now, SETI is S-E-T-I. It's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And what they do is they have these giant satellite dishes, and they search the stars for radio signals that might have come from an intelligent source. And what they do is they look for information in the patterns, because information can only come from an intelligent source, and we see information in DNA all the time. We've never seen a mutation that increases the information in a genome. We've seen mutations that duplicate existing information. We see mutations that change existing information. We never see an increase in information. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering, if you hear a sound in the background, that's my dog scratching to be let into my bedroom. My apologies. Anyway, in science, we have the science of archaeology, and they infer intelligence all the time. I mean, it's constantly inferred. Now, when we look at so the idea that science is not allowed to consider intelligence and to infer intelligent design is automatically pseudoscience, that's just plain nonsense, because then you have to say that archaeology is a pseudoscience, and you'd have to throw out a lot of things in the science textbooks, because we're not allowed to consider archaeology. If we discover an automobile, we're not allowed to say, well, Ford automobiles have to be the product of natural processes. We're not allowed to consider the possibility that they were formed by an intelligence. I mean, and of course, this is just utter nonsense. The idea we're not allowed to consider the possibility of an intelligence. Now, this is just, and of course, this is just basic common sense reasoning. Now, let me, one second, let me bring that dog in, and then I'm going to address the argument that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of, some of you will say, okay, or we can consider the possibility that ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, or, if you watch that stupid nonsense on the History Channel, that the idea that aliens built the pyramids. Now, of course, I don't think all of their arguments are totally bad. I just don't think they have a justifiable case. One second, let me let that dog in. Come on in. Good girl. Up on the bed. My guilty secret is I sit here on my bed to film these because it gives me a perfect angle. Now, we're not allowed. The idea in science that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of God is something that wasn't invented till after the time of Darwin. I mean, it just plain doesn't hold water. It's saying, well, often Christians are accused of not allowing science to explore any possibilities that might be outside of the Bible. Now, whether that's true or not, materialists are doing. Now, materialists, they're people who believe that the universe is just the natural, just the physical. It's all just matter and energy. Alright, in science, we often hear the argument that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of God. Now, this doesn't hold water with, like the other argument, that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of intelligence. The argument that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of God, it doesn't hold to reason, logic, or rationality. It just doesn't hold. It doesn't hold with the history of science either. The idea that science is not allowed to consider the possibility of a creator God isn't something that was invented until after the time of Darwin. And it really is just a self-serving argument for evolutionists to dismiss the possibility of creation just because they don't like it. It's very similar to, if you look in the history of science, you'll learn that there was a time when people in geology were dismissing the possibility of catastrophism as the idea that catastrophes happen, because they didn't want to consider the possibility of Noah's flood and said, well, basically, we're not allowed to consider the possibility of catastrophes. And of course, the eruption of Mount St. Helens kind of blew away any idea that we're not allowed to consider catastrophes in geology. And the idea that we're not allowed to consider God is just a way of putting science into a little tiny box. Now, it doesn't mean you can just run with any idea. It doesn't mean we're advocating God of the gaps. All it means is that we can consider the possibility that there is a creator who created life, who created the universe, and unfortunately for the evolutionists, that's really where the evidence is leading. In science, we need to be able to follow all the possibilities. We need to be able to consider all of the possibilities. Otherwise, what we're doing is not science. We need to open the door to say, hey, we want to see where the evidence leads, not where do I want to make the evidence lead. If you're saying, well, we're not allowed to consider the possibility of God, even though 100% of the evidence points in that direction, and there's a famous quote, and I don't remember how it goes exactly, but there was a scientist who said, in science, even if 100% of the evidence pointed towards an intelligent designer, we're not allowed to consider that possibility because the idea of an intelligence is unscientific. And I would say, well, that's not really the case. If the evidence leads towards intelligence, as it does on CSI and NCIS constantly, towards the murderer, then we should follow the evidence. Science is about following the evidence wherever it leads. And if that leads us to God, then so be it. And that doesn't mean that we're just going to randomly infer that there's fairies making the leaves turn brown and fall or anything like that. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, let's follow the evidence. The evidence does say that there was a creator of the universe, that there was a creator of life on earth. And the more we learn about the evidence, the more it's pointing towards the creator God of the Bible. We know that the universe had a beginning, just as the Bible says. We know that the universe, we know that life doesn't come from non-life, just as the Bible says it doesn't. The Bible says life only comes from life, and the original life was created by God. And in Him is life. Now, the idea that we're not allowed to consider God, that we're not allowed to consider the supernatural, it's really just a self-serving argument. All it is the atheist materialist saying, well, you can consider any possibility as long as it doesn't contradict my beliefs. You consider any possibility in science as long as it doesn't contradict the belief of atheist materialism. And, by the way, an atheist is somebody who believes that there is no God. It's often confused with an agnostic, which is somebody who's not sure if there's a God, or not sure, what's true about the spiritual. An atheist is, by the definition of an atheist is somebody who believes that there is no God, and very often people will get those two confused. I've even heard guys say, hey, I'm not sure if there's a God, I'm an atheist, and he got kind of mad at me for contradicting him. But to say, hey, we're not allowed to consider anything outside of the Bible of atheist materialism, I mean, come on. I mean, that's exactly what you accuse us Christians of doing all the time, of not allowing science to explore anywhere outside of the Bible. And of course, it's silly. I mean, the stereotype that we hear all the time is no longer true about Christians, but it is what Christians have been accused of, atheist materialists are guilty of today. Even if not all of them are, the established majority who are in power, they are guilty of this. And at the end of the day, the evidence does indicate that life is a result of an intelligent designer of some sort, and that the universe is the result of an intelligent designer of some sort. Of course, I'm not going into the evidence in this video because it's just beyond the scope of one video. I have more videos on my website, which is greenslug.com, and slug is spelled with 2 G's, so it's GREENSLUGG.com, and I have videos uploaded to my YouTube account. If you want proof that God is there and God is the creator, there you go. So we know the universe is designed. We know that life is designed, because that's what we're finding. Even if the majority don't accept it yet, it's what we're finding. And the evidence is really pointing towards the Bible, because the Bible has, as I've shown you in my other videos, the Bible has been dead on. The Bible is where doctors originally got the idea of washing their hands with running water instead of using stagnant water. The Bible is where we originally got the idea that life only comes from life. And Louis Pasteur and men like him read this in the Bible and ended up discovering germ theory, which is the idea that diseases don't just spontaneously form in the body. Obviously, things like cancer are a little different, but microorganisms don't just spontaneously form in the body. They come from other microorganisms. This was germ theory. The facts really point towards a creator God for life and the universe as a whole. And as we study the facts more and more, we find that it's pointing towards the Bible. And the Quran teaches the sun set in a mud puddle. The Bible never teaches such nonsense. The Bible teaches that God suspends the earth on nothing. The Greeks taught that the earth was held up by Atlas. So who was right in that one fact? Who was right? It wasn't the Greeks. Often people accuse the Bible of teaching geocentrism. It's the idea that the sun goes around the earth. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible will say, well, the sun rises and the sun sets. Yes, it uses that term. We use that term today. It's called the language of appearance. Even astronomers, professional astronomers, will use this terminology, knowing it's the language of appearance. People will say, well, the Bible taught that the earth is flat. Nowhere does the Bible teach that. The Bible taught that the earth is a sphere. And I have references in my other videos. But the idea that we're not allowed to consider an intelligent designer just does not hold water. It doesn't fit with the facts of science. It doesn't fit with the history of science. It doesn't fit with what the founders of modern science, like Isaac Newton, believed. Isaac Newton and the majority of the founders of modern science were, not only were they Christians, they were biblical creationists, and the majority of them believed in 6 literal days. And there's only a handful that were the exception that believed in an old earth version of creation. But the idea that we're not allowed to consider intelligence, we're not allowed to consider creator, we're not allowed to consider God, everything has to follow the Bible of atheism, it just wasn't held by them. It wasn't held by them then, and it's not held by many scientists today, and it's not logical. Why should science, why should the truth, science, another scientist has said, science is the search for truth. And the truth isn't going to just be forced in a tiny little box, no matter how much you want it to be the case. The truth is going to be the truth. And unfortunately, it's going to make a lot of people, it makes them very, very mad. The truth is pointing in the direction of the Bible. And now, as a Christian, I'm not forcing the truth to fit in the Bible. The truth is just flowing that way. So, that's my answer to the argument of, well, that's my counter argument to the idea that we're not allowed to consider the possibility of intelligence, we're not allowed to consider the possibility of God, we're not allowed to consider the possibility of the supernatural in science. Come on, let's stop this let's stop this nonsense. Okay, the pyramids didn't form naturally, and we're not being scientific by inferring that they were. And of course, I'm not saying that evolutionists do this because they never would, but it's the cell is. If we look at the cell, we look through microscopes. It's a lot more clear that the cells were designed than it is that the pyramids were designed. All right. God bless you all, and I want to remind you of something. Matthew 11:28 says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and loaded down with burdens, and I will give you rest." Or, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And that's Jesus in Matthew 11:28. And Romans 1:20 says that because, to paraphrase it, it says, because God has made himself so evident and so clear through nature, men are without excuse to reject him. God is clear in the creation, and that's the answer. That's also an answer about why it is so important for Christians to use creation, because it's one of the, I don't know of any other place in the Bible, probably is, but I don't know of any other argument in the Bible that says, where God says the men are without excuse to reject him. The only one I know of is, if you point to the creation, the evidence for designing the world is so obvious, men are without an excuse to reject the Creator God. And if that causes some division in the church, then so be it. Alright, this is Greg out.